I want you to start by just doing a little thought experiment with me today.
Mm.
Wherever you happen to be listening to this deep dive.
Right.
Imagine you are holding a simple, everyday object. Let's say, it's just a standard glass of water.
Okay, glass of water.
Yeah. Now, imagine you hold it out in front of you, right over a hard tile floor.
Yo, I see where this is going.
And you just open your hand, you let it go. What happens? I mean, you don't even have to think about the answer, right? It falls, it hits the floor, it shatters into 100 pieces, and water just splashes everywhere.
Exactly, because it's immediate, it's completely observable, and it is entirely inescapable.
Right.
I mean, Sir Isaac Newton laid this out for us centuries ago. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah, basic physics.
We accept this fundamental reality of physics without even a second thought. Like if you jump off a wall, gravity pulls you back down to the earth.
Every single time.
Every time. If you carelessly place your hand on a glowing hot stove, your cellular tissue burns. The physical universe operates strictly on these rules, and we never, ever expect those rules to take a day off.
We really don't. We don't negotiate with gravity.
No, you can't.
But I want to ask you, the listener, a much more difficult question. What happens when you tell a lie?
Ooh, yeah, that's different.
Right. Think about the actual mechanics of it. What happens when a massive, multinational corporation deliberately exploits its workers just to artificially inflate its quarterly profit margins?
Right, or the reverse.
Exactly. On the flip side, what happens when a neighbor goes completely out of their way at great personal cost to help another neighbor in the dead of night, with no expectation of a reward?
Is there an equal and opposite reaction for those things?
Right. Is there a physics of human behavior?
And, the hesitation most people feel when trying to answer that question is just fascinating.
It really is.
Because we are so incredibly comfortable navigating the rigid laws of thermodynamics, right? But we become defensive, maybe even a little anxious, when we try to apply that same rigorous, inescapable logic to our social and moral lives.
Yeah, we like to think of morality as this foggy, ambiguous space.
Exactly. We treat social actions as if their cause and effect are totally disjointed, like they just float away into the ether.
But the deep dive we are taking today focuses on an argument that completely, just absolutely rejects that ambiguity.
It does, completely.
The author we're studying today posits that moral physics is just as real and just as unforgiving as physical physics.
So we are unpacking a truly fascinating, incredibly dense lecture transcript today.
Very dense.
Yeah, this isn't just casual philosophical musing. It's an urgent, highly structured sociological analysis that was actually delivered back in August of 1970.
Right, and the author is doing this deep dive into Quranic principles, specifically drawing from a chapter called Surah Yunus, and he's translating those ancient verses into this grand, unified theory of human existence.
And the beating heart of this entire theory is a concept called the law of requital.
The law of requital.
Yes, or in the original Arabic text, the term is Makafat-e-Amal.
Makafat-e-Amal, okay.
Right. And we are going to explore the profound argument that every single action within the human social system has an absolute, inescapable reaction.
It's a huge claim.
It is. And the author issues this staggering warning, which is that if a society masters the physical sciences but completely ignores this moral framework, they are mathematically guaranteeing their own collapse.
Wow. Okay, so before we really delve into the mechanics of this theory, we do need to clearly set the parameters for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely.
Because as your guides on this exploration, it's crucial to state that the source text we are analyzing touches upon deeply held religious, theological, and philosophical viewpoints.
Right, we're dealing with concepts of faith, divine law, scriptural interpretation.
Exactly. And our role here is not to endorse these religious frameworks, right? We're not picking sides in historical or theological debates.
No, not at all.
Our mission is strictly to neutrally report on the content of this text, to synthesize the arguments being made, and to basically help you understand the profound sociological points the author is raising about the nature of humanity and civilization and consequence.
Perfect. So let's lay the groundwork. Because before the author can even begin to explain how human actions trigger consequences in the physical world, he forces his audience to stop and answer this really foundational question.
A question that ancient philosophers wrestled with for, what, millennia?
Literally millennia. And that question is the physical world even real?
Right, and I don't mean that in the modern, Silicon Valley, are we living in a computer simulation kind of way.
No, not the Matrix.
Yeah, I mean, historically. How did humanity historically view the dirt beneath their feet, the flesh on their bones, and the stars in the sky?
So the text offers this very sharp, systemic critique of ancient philosophies and religious traditions. It points out a fascinating historical pattern of denial.
Denial of the physical world.
Exactly. Look at the Greeks, right? Specifically Plato. You have this prevailing idea of the ideal forms.
Oh, yeah, the allegory of the cave.
Right. The philosophical argument there was that the physical universe we interact with, so the trees we touch, the food we eat, is not the true reality.
It's just a shadow.
Yes, it is merely a shadow, a deeply flawed, temporary reflection of a higher, perfect reality that exists exclusively in this intangible realm of ideas.
So we're all just chained in the dark, looking at blurry shadows cast on a wall, and we mistake those shadows for reality.
Exactly. And the author traces how that specific philosophical seed grew and spread across civilizations. It evolved into Neoplatonism, taking deep root in intellectual hubs like Alexandria.
Right.
And from there, it didn't just stay a philosophical musing. It seeped into the theological frameworks of various emerging religions.
The text actually points out how this influenced certain strands of early Christian monasticism, right?
Yes, it does. Where the material world, like matter itself, was viewed as inherently corrupt, impure, or even literally dirty.
So the prevailing thought was that the human spirit was pure, but the body and the physical earth were these traps designed to degrade that spirit.
Right, and the author also draws parallels to ancient Indian philosophy. He references the Hindu concept of Maya, which loosely translates to illusion.
Okay.
So in these historical frameworks, the ultimate spiritual goal, like the absolute pinnacle of religious piety, was to realize that the world is a mirage and to actively escape it.
You know, when I was reading this part of the source, I was really trying to conceptualize how this feels in modern terms.
Yeah.
And it honestly reminds me of rage quitting a video game.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Like, imagine you're playing this incredibly complex, frustrating game called Life on Earth.
Right.
The graphics are way too intense, the physics engine is punishingly hard, the other players are difficult and completely unpredictable.
Yeah, the multiplayer is toxic.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
your solution to all that stress is just to throw the controller at the screen, unplug the console, and walk away.
Rage quit.
Yeah. In these ancient traditions, true holiness meant retreating to a cave in the mountains, abandoning all your wealth, severing your worldly relationships.
Just actively fleeing from material reality.
Exactly. You make yourself as detached as physically possible just to avoid the pain of the game.
Well, the author's central thesis in this section is that the Quran presented a massive paradigm-shifting challenge to that entire worldview.
The text explicitly calls it a challenge to religion, as religion was understood at that time.
Yes. The Quranic assertion, according to the source, is that the universe is absolutely not an illusion. It is not a mirage. It is created with haq.
Haq. H-A-Q-Q.
Right. Now, haq is an incredibly rich Arabic term. The author translates it as truth, absolute reality, and inherent purpose.
Okay, so the universe isn't some dirty, corrupted distraction you're supposed to escape.
No, it is a deliberate, magnificent, highly engineered creation.
So the author's basically saying no rage quitting allowed.
Zero rage quitting.
You aren't just placed in the game to suffer. You are mandated to play it and to actively understand its mechanics.
You are absolutely mandated to engage with it. The author argues that looking at the physical universe with disgust,
Right.
or, treating it as something impure to be avoided, is fundamentally an insult to its creator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because if you claim to revere an architect, you cannot simultaneously express contempt for the building they just spent immense effort designing.
That makes so much sense.
The physical world in this framework is a masterpiece. It's
Mm.
meant to be studied, interacted with, measured, respected.
It's the tangible staging ground for human existence, not just a miserable waiting room for the afterlife.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a point where the text completely shattered my expectations.
Oh, the Ulema part.
Yes. Because if we accept the premise that the universe is real, that it's purposeful and absolutely not an illusion, then what is humanity's actual job description?
Right. What do we do with all this purposeful matter?
Exactly. And the author takes a word that is incredibly common in Islamic terminology, the word ulema, and he completely redefines it based on his reading of the text.
Yeah, this is a fascinating linguistic shift.
Because, listener, if you're familiar with the term ulema, you likely associate it with religious scholars.
You picture men sitting in mosques.
Right. Debating theology, reading ancient legal texts, memorizing scriptures.
The traditional Orthodox understanding of the term is strictly theological.
But the author systematically dismantles this limitation.
He really does. He points to specific verses, particularly from a chapter called Surah Fatir, to argue that the Quran's definition of true scholars, the true Ulema, is vastly different.
Yeah, and the verses he references to define this group, they don't mention fasting.
Well,
They don't mention prayer rituals or theology at all.
right, they talk entirely about the natural world.
Exactly. They describe rain falling from the sky and bringing forth fruits of various colors.
They describe mountains having distinct tracks and streaks of white, red, and intense black rock.
And they describe the immense biological diversity of humans, beasts, and cattle.
And the text asks this brilliant, seemingly obvious question based on those verses. Who are the people who actually study the different colors of rock strata to understand the evolutionary stages of the Earth?
It's not theologians.
No, it's geologists.
Right, and who are the people who study the rain cycle, atmospheric pressure, and weather systems?
Meteorologists.
Who spends their lives studying the different species of crawling and flying creatures to understand human and animal evolution.
Biologists.
So the author is making this incredibly bold linguistic and philosophical claim here. He's saying the true ulema, mentioned in these verses, the people who possess actual divine knowledge, are the scientists.
It is a radical conceptual reclamation.
Totally radical.
The author is arguing that science is not some separate secular sphere of knowledge that just exists in opposition to religion.
Right.
In this framework, the scientific method, so the rigorous observation, hypothesis testing, discovery of the natural world, is a deeply spiritual endeavor.
The text literally asserts that conquering the physical forces of nature is a direct requirement of faith.
Because to truly understand the Creator, you must intimately understand the mechanics of the creation.
You have to learn the physics of the building.
Exactly.
I found myself really pausing here to just let that sink in. The text is literally saying that doing scientific research like sitting in a laboratory looking through an electron microscope or doing complex calculus to send a probe into deep space is a religious mandate.
Yeah.
It frames the pursuit of scientific data as an act of worship.
He states that the mo'minin, the true believers, are fundamentally required to conquer the forces of nature. And you cannot conquer what you do not understand.
So you have to study the physical laws.
Yes. And the author brings in a fascinating external reference to bolster this point. He mentions a book called The Great Design.
Oh, right.
Which basically compiled the thoughts of various top-tier scientists across different fields. We're talking leading astronomers, biologists, quantum physicists.
And what's striking is that he points out many of these scientists identified as atheists.
Right.
Or at least they actively rejected traditional dogmatic religion. They certainly weren't, looking for God in their telescopes.
But the author highlights their ultimate collective conclusion. When these scientists pushed the absolute boundaries of human knowledge in their fields...
When they really got into the weeds.
Exactly. When they saw the staggering, mind-bending complexity of the universe, like the delicate mathematical balance of gravity that prevents galaxies from just collapsing in on themselves.
Or the intricate, unimaginably dense coding of human DNA.
Or the precise orchestration of planetary orbits.
Yeah.
When they saw all that, they were forced into a state of profound humility.
They admitted that this level of complexity could not be entirely haphazard.
Right. They perceived a grand, unaccidental design. And the author uses this to prove his point. Studying science naturally inevitably leads to a profound awe of the universe's systems.
So when an astronomer looks through a telescope and realizes the sheer, terrifying scale of a galaxy, the feeling of absolute insignificance and wonder they experience.
According to this text, that is the exact feeling of reverence that religion is attempting to cultivate.
So the argument is that the atheist scientist in the lab, who is unraveling the mysteries of quantum mechanics and feeling a profound sense of awe at the elegance of the math, is actually closer to fulfilling this specific mandate of studying creation than someone who just sits in a dark room meditating and ignoring the outside world.
That is exactly the argument.
That is quite the argument, but it brings us to a crucial friction point.
Right, the moral aspect.
Because science gives us the how. It gives us the tools to conquer nature. It gives us the knowledge to split the atom, harness electricity, alter genetic codes.
But science itself is morally neutral.
Completely. A nuclear reaction doesn't possess a conscience. It doesn't care if it's powering a children's hospital or literally leveling a city.
No, it just reacts.
So how do we decide what to do with that immense power once we have it?
Well, this is where we arrive at the absolute crux of the deep dive. This is where the physics of the universe intersects with the physics of society.
Okay.
According to the source, reality is governed by two distinct parallel sets of laws. On one side, you have the physical laws of nature, the laws that the Ulema of science discover.
Gravity, electromagnetism, thermodynamics.
Exactly. These laws are unbreakable, objective, and amoral. But on the other side, running in parallel, you have the divine social laws, the moral values.
And just as the physical universe runs on physical physics, human society runs on the law of requital. Makafat-e-Amal.
Yes.
I really want to unpack the mechanics of Makafat-e-Amal here, because requital basically means recompense or consequence.
Right.
The text frames it as this inescapable cosmic ledger.
A ledger, yes.
Because if we look at the human justice system, right, the societal ledger we've built, we know it is incredibly flawed. It has missing pages, massive loopholes.
Oh, absolutely.
You might commit a terrible crime, say massive corporate fraud that ruins thousands of lives. But if you're wealthy enough, if you hire a brilliant legal team, or if you just, hide the paper trail well enough,
You can get away with it.
you can input a negative action and entirely avoid the negative reaction.
In the human system, yes. But the author is arguing that the law of requital has perfect, terrifyingly accurate accounting.
So there's no escaping it.
None. The author insists that every single intent, every thought, and every action you input into the social system produces an absolute, unavoidable result.
It's not just a metaphor.
No, it's not. If you exploit someone, that action doesn't just disappear into the ether once the transaction is over.
Right.
It physically and psychologically alters the fabric of your own psyche, and it ripples out to alter the fabric of society. It sets a literal chain reaction into motion.
And what the author emphasizes heavily here is a point of radical departure from a lot of traditional theological interpretations.
Yes, the timing of the consequence.
Because many traditions focus heavily on the afterlife, right? Like, you suffer now, but you get justice after you die.
But the text rejects pushing the consequences entirely into the postmortem realm. The author argues that the law of requital is active right now in the physical, material world.
So it's an ongoing sociological and psychological reality.
Exactly. Whatever energy, positive or negative, you input into the social system of humanity, you and your society will inevitably have to endure the output in this life.
You cannot trick the system any more than you can trick gravity by closing your eyes.
That's a great way to put it.
So I want to know how this actually plays out in the real world. The theory sounds solid, but how do different human societies actually interact with these two parallel sets of laws?
Well, the text provides a fascinating sociological breakdown. It categorizes humanity based on their relationship to physical physics and moral physics.
Let's explore that, because this shows how civilizations rise and fall based on this balance, right?
Yes. The author provides three very stark categories.
Yeah.
Let's start with the first group. The text refers to them as the believers, or the mutaki. This group represents the ultimate ideal.
Because they successfully master both.
Exactly. They master the physical laws of science. They actively conquer nature, invent, discover, build robust infrastructure. But crucially, they simultaneously and strictly adhere to the divine social laws, the law of requital.
So they have the technological power of, say, a nuclear reactor, but they have the moral compass to ensure it only ever provides clean, accessible energy to everyone.
Yes, they don't exploit the workers who built it, and they don't hoard the energy for the elite.
They use the immense power derived from conquering nature strictly for the betterment, the uplifting, and the profound peace of all humanity.
And they completely refuse to use their scientific leverage to subjugate weaker nations. They perfectly synthesize power and morality.
Okay, so that's the ideal. What about the second group?
The text calls them the materialists.
The materialists, okay.
And this group is highly advanced, perhaps even more so technologically than the first group. They master the physical laws of science. They conquer nature.
Right.
They build incredible infrastructure, powerful global economies, awe-inspiring technologies.
However, they completely ignore the divine social laws.
Completely. They reject the reality of the law of requital. They fundamentally believe their wealth and power make them immune to consequence.
And the text is very explicit here, right? It points to Western materialism as the prime example of this group.
It does. They have the technology, they have the mastery over nature, but they use that immense power for exploitation, for economic colonization, for hoarding wealth.
And for the creation of devastating weaponry.
Yes. And the author notes the tragic, unavoidable irony of this group.
Because the law of requital still applies to them.
Exactly. Because they ignore the moral laws, their society, despite its glittering technological advancements and massive GDP, ultimately becomes deeply hellish.
They build weapons capable of mass extinction. They create massive, destabilizing wealth inequality.
And their societies become plagued by profound psychological distress, alienation, endless conflict.
They have mastered the atom, but they haven't mastered their own greed.
Precisely. They are the living proof that science devoid of a moral framework is mathematically guaranteed to be destructive.
Wow. Which brings us to the third group.
Yes. And this is where the author's critique becomes incredibly sharp and uncomfortable.
The text calls this group the ignorant, or the gafaloon.
Right. These are the people who ignore both sets of laws.
So they ignore the moral laws of society, but they also completely reject the physical laws of science.
They refuse to study the universe, they refuse to conquer nature, and they view scientific advancement with suspicion or outright hostility.
The author argues that this group is essentially living a subhuman existence.
Because they have abdicated their fundamental responsibility as inhabitants of the physical world.
But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Based on how a lot of people view religion, isn't this third group exactly what many people picture when they think of a highly religious, pious, saintly person?
Oh, absolutely.
Like someone who rejects the material world, refuses to engage in the dirty business of industry or science, and lives in voluntary poverty just to focus only on their spiritual purity.
Yes, the classic ascetic.
For centuries, we've been told that poverty, suffering, and detachment are next to godliness.
And the author brilliantly dismantles the romanticization of the ascetic.
How so?
He argues that because this group refuses to conquer nature, because they stubbornly refuse to learn the physical laws, they render themselves entirely helpless.
Right.
And in their helplessness, they become entirely reliant on the very materialists they claim to despise.
The anecdote the text uses to illustrate this is devastatingly visual.
It's so good.
It describes a religious preacher, an ascetic, standing on a pulpit. He is giving a fiery, passionate sermon, absolutely cursing the materialist nations.
Denouncing their way of life as evil, corrupt, doomed.
But as he gives the sermon, his voice is being amplified by a microphone and a loudspeaker system that was invented, manufactured, and shipped by those exact same materialists.
Yep. His mosque is lit by electricity, harnessed by the scientific laws discovered by those materialists.
Even the steel needle used to stitch the simple clothes on his back likely came from their industrialized factories.
It perfectly highlights the ultimate hypocrisy and humiliation of ignoring physical laws.
So they sit in the dark, complaining and cursing, completely dependent on the inventions of the people they view as their mortal enemies.
Because they haven't put in the rigorous work to understand the universe, they are victims of it. And victims of those who have understood it.
They literally beg for bread while claiming an unearned spiritual superiority.
To the author, this is not piety. It is an insult to human potential. It is a catastrophic failure to fulfill the fundamental mandate of existing in a physical universe.
Okay, so we have the three models. The ideal who masters both physics and morality. The materialist who masters physics but fails morality. And the ignorant who fails at both.
Right.
As I was reading this sociological breakdown, a massive question just kept nagging at me. If this law of requital is as absolute and inescapable as gravity, why does it seem so slow?
Yes. The timeline.
Let's go back to the physics analogy. If I jump off a roof, gravity punishes me instantly. I hit the ground in seconds.
Unforgiving and immediate.
But if a corrupt politician embezzles millions of dollars meant for public housing, or a corporation knowingly poisons a river to save money on waste disposal, they often don't face instant consequences.
They might live long, wealthy, seemingly incredibly happy lives.
Exactly. Why do the wicked prosper? If the cosmic ledger is so perfect, why is the billing cycle so delayed?
You've hit on perhaps the most psychologically profound part of the entire text.
Okay.
The author addresses this exact friction through the concept of Mohlat, which translates to the grace period.
Mohlat, the grace period.
And you're entirely right to ask about the delay, because it is the delay that deeply confuses human beings and makes them doubt the existence of moral physics.
It definitely does.
The text references the philosopher John Locke here, specifically his observations about human haste.
Oh, right. Locke noted that humans are incredibly impatient creatures.
Very impatient. We operate on a microscopic timescale.
We want immediate gratification for our good deeds, and we demand immediate revenge for our grievances. Like if someone wrongs us, we want a lightning bolt to strike them right that second to prove the universe is just.
We judge the vast complex mechanics of the universe by our own hasty, emotional timeline. But the author argues that the law of requital operates on a deliberate, mathematically necessary delay.
The cosmos does not rush.
No, it processes actions through complex societal webs.
To understand this, I found it super helpful to think about agriculture.
Okay, yeah.
Because you go out into a field and you plant a seed of a highly poisonous plant, you don't instantly die the moment the seed hits the dirt.
Right.
There is a necessary gap of time required by the laws of biology. The seed has to germinate in the dark, it has to grow roots, it has to break the surface, it has to flower, and it has to bear its deadly fruit before you can consume it and suffer the fatal consequence.
And the law of requital works the exact same way.
Yeah.
You plant the seed of corruption in the social fabric, but the harvest takes time to mature.
Right. It's an excellent way to visualize it.
And the text dives deeply into the profound brilliance of this mechanism. The author argues that divine mercy is quite literally defined by this delay, this mohlat.
How so?
Think about the alternative. If consequences were as instantaneous as gravity-like, if your hand literally caught fire the very second you told a lie,
Oh, wow.
or your heart stopped the moment you stole a coin, humanity would be wiped out entirely after a single generation.
Because no human being is perfect.
Exactly. Every society makes destructive errors.
So the grace period is actually a feature, not a bug in the system. It's the only thing keeping us alive.
It is the most vital feature. This grace period is the sacred space where human agency and course correction happen.
It's the window of opportunity.
The author compares it to contracting an illness. When a deadly virus enters your bloodstream, you don't drop dead that exact second.
Right. There is a biological gap between getting infected and the fatal outcome.
And that specific gap, the incubation period, is the exact window where medicine can be administered to save your life.
Ah, I see. So the delay between the crime and the punishment in the law of requital is the window where an individual or an entire society can realize, wow, the social indicators are flashing red. We are heading down a dark path we need to drastically turn around.
Exactly. It's the space for systemic repentance and restitution.
But the text issues a chilling warning about human nature here.
It does.
Because what do humans usually do with this vital grace period?
We fundamentally misinterpret it. The text warns that many people, perhaps the vast majority of societies, mistake this grace period for immunity.
Yes.
Because the lightning bolt didn't strike them immediately, they assume the sky is empty.
They look at their rising stock portfolios after exploiting a workforce and assume they got away with it.
They assume the law of requital is a myth,
Yeah.
or that the system is broken and they are just the clever ones who beat it.
Which brings up a terrifying scenario. What happens when a society uses that grace period not to administer the medicine, not to course correct, but to double down on the corruption?
Yeah. What happens when a civilization just keeps planting more and more poisonous seeds, assuming winter will never come?
Exactly.
When a society does that, it enters a dangerous psychological state. The text introduces the concept of zenat, which translates to the beautification or the intense normalization of bad deeds.
Normalization.
Yes, when an entire community or an entire nation walks the wrong moral path for a sustained period, a collective psychological shift occurs.
Evil stops looking like evil.
Right. It stops feeling wrong or transgressive. It just becomes the way things are done. The culture literally rewires its own conscience.
And the text gives such a relatable, kind of mundane anecdote to illustrate how this happens on a micro level.
The clerk example.
Yes, it talks about a localized system of corruption. So imagine a low-level clerk in a government office who takes a small bribe just to process a routine piece of paper.
Initially, his internal conscience might bother him. He feels the friction of the law of requital.
But then he looks around his office and he sees that his direct manager is taking a bribe 10 times as large.
And the director of the department is actively embezzling millions.
Right. So the clerk justifies his small crime by saying, well, everyone else is doing it and they're making a fortune. I'm actually the honest one for only stealing a little bit to feed my family.
And the individual guilt entirely evaporates because the societal environment has beautified and normalized the behavior.
The whole society becomes a powerful magnetic field of corruption.
And to understand how powerful that field is, the author expands on the concept of orientation.
Okay, the compass analogy.
Right. In a deeply corrupt society, an average, ordinary person with decent intentions is like a compass needle.
And a compass needle naturally wants to point true north. It has a baseline orientation toward morality.
But if you take that compass and drop it into the middle of a massive artificial magnetic field, A society completely saturated with normalized corruption, where greed is rewarded and honesty is penalized, that needle is going to spin wildly.
Right.
And eventually, it will succumb to the overwhelming local magnetic force and align itself perfectly with the corruption.
It will point to a false north, and the person holding the compass will swear they are walking in the right direction. I really want to push back on the physics of this metaphor, though.
Okay, how so?
If a society is a giant electromagnet of normalized evil, and an ordinary person is a compass needle that will inevitably align with the corruption, how does anyone survive that?
It's a great question.
Like, how does one person stay true north when the entire field is pulling them the other way?
You're right to push back, because a compass physically cannot resist a stronger magnetic field. It's impossible.
Right.
But the author argues that to resist that kind of overwhelming societal pull, an individual must completely change the mechanism of their orientation. They cannot be a compass needle anymore. They must become a gyroscope.
Oh, a gyroscope. Explain the difference there.
Well, a compass relies entirely on external fields to tell it where to point. If the external field is corrupted, the compass is corrupted.
Right, it's passive.
But a gyroscope relies on its own internal, incredibly rapid spin to maintain its orientation. It maintains its axis regardless of the external forces pressing against it.
That makes sense.
So the author is saying a person must develop an absolute, unshakable internal conviction in the divine social laws, in the reality of the law of requital.
This internal conviction must be spinning so powerfully that it overrides the overwhelming normalized evidence of their immediate corrupt surroundings.
Exactly.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize moral resistance. But we do have to look at the reality of being a gyroscope in a world of corrupted compasses.
Not easy.
Not at all. What happens to that person? I mean, think about your own workplace or community. Have you ever noticed how a tiny rule break by a manager suddenly makes everyone else feel okay about cutting corners? Oh, absolutely.
Now imagine someone standing up in that environment and refusing to play along.
Right.
If an honest person stands up in a society that has normalized bribery under Zenit and says, hey, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this, they aren't hailed as a hero, are they?
No. And the text is ruthlessly clear about this social dynamic.
Because the society is entirely under the spell of Zenit, because the evil has been beautified and normalized, the honest person is viewed as the dangerous anomaly.
They are mocked. They are actively ostracized.
Society looks at the person refusing a bribe and calls them a fool, or naive, or even a madman for turning down free money.
The moral polarity of the entire society has flipped, so the sane person is treated as insane, and the corrupt person is elected as a leader.
It's terrifying. Let's follow this timeline to its logical, mathematical conclusion, though.
Okay.
You have the physical laws and the moral laws. A society chooses to master the physical, but they ignore the moral.
Right.
They enter the grace period, Mohlat. They mistake the delay for immunity. They double down on exploitation. The corruption becomes normalized. It becomes Zenat. Everyone is pointing to false north.
What is the end game? When the grace period finally inevitably runs out and the massive harvest of those poisonous seeds arrives, what does that actually look like right here on Earth?
Well, the text posits two extreme outcomes based on how a society navigates this, and they are essentially the creation of heaven or hell on Earth.
Literally on Earth.
Literally. The author argues that if a society manages to combine scientific mastery, so conquering nature to provide abundance, with strict adherence to moral law, the result is Janet. Paradise on Earth.
And the defining characteristic of this earthly paradise is a concept called salamti,
Salamti, yes.
which translates to profound structural peace.
And we really need to pause and look at the etymology of Salamti because it's completely blew my mind.
Oh, yeah. This is fascinating.
Because we throw the word peace around all the time in modern English. We say peace out, we flash peace signs, it's put it on T-shirts.
It often means nothing more than goodbye or chill out.
Even in Arabic, the traditional greeting is Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. But the author argues this is not just a polite hello or good morning.
Right. In the framework of a society that has mastered the law of requital, this greeting is actually a profound, legally binding social contract.
The author elevates the greeting from a mere pleasantry to an absolute guarantee of security.
So when a person in this ideal society says peace to another, they are effectively verbally signing a contract.
Yes, they are saying, I am a guarantor of your life, your property, and your psychological safety.
You have absolutely nothing to fear from me.
I will not exploit your labor, I will not deceive you in business, and my physical or economic strength is a shield for you, not a weapon against you.
Imagine walking down the street and every single person who makes eye contact with you is verbally guaranteeing your safety.
If an entire society operates on this specific contract of salamti, combined with the medical and technological abundance provided by scientific mastery.
You literally have an earthly paradise, no poverty, no fear.
But then there's the inescapable flip side. What happens when the grace period ends for a society that normalized corruption?
And the text doesn't mince words here.
No, it points directly to the graveyard of history.
It notes that previous mighty nations and global empires were wiped off the map.
But importantly, the author insists they weren't destroyed by arbitrary magic or, unexplainable divine wrath.
Right, they were destroyed because they fundamentally ignored the sociological warnings of their times.
They violated the physics of human behavior.
Their destruction was the logical reaction to their action.
Exactly. The mechanics of their destruction were the direct, mathematically certain result of their own actions.
Excessive greed mathematically leads to economic collapse.
Extreme wealth inequality mathematically leads to violent, destabilizing revolution.
Imperial overreach mathematically leads to resource exhaustion and catastrophic vulnerability.
The law of requital simply played out its billing cycle.
And the author makes a very poignant point regarding modern humanity, because the warnings given to those past nations are now permanently recorded in historical and scriptural texts.
The sociological case studies of failed civilizations are literally written down.
We have the data on what happens when you build an empire on slavery or extreme wealth disparity.
And because that data is recorded and accessible, the responsibility to heed those warnings falls squarely on the current community.
The text asserts a really harsh reality here. If a community possesses this knowledge, if they have the historical data showing that corruption leads to destruction, and they still fail to act on it,
they become entirely complicit in their own demise. They cannot plead ignorance when the structural collapse happens.
This brings the massive cosmic philosophy crashing down into a very specific, high-stakes, real-world reality.
It really does.
Because throughout this deep dive, we've been talking about these concepts in the abstract.
Right, theory.
But we have to look at the historical anchor of this entire lecture to understand the true urgency in the author's voice. We mentioned at the very beginning that this was delivered in August of 1970.
Yes.
But the specific date and the specific geography is the absolute key to unlocking the whole text.
It was delivered on August 14, 1970 in Pakistan.
August 14th is the Independence Day of Pakistan.
Yes. So the author was speaking to a nation celebrating its creation, a nation that was still incredibly young and trying to define its trajectory.
Right.
And he uses this grand cosmic theory of the law of requital to frame the very existence and purpose of the state. He quotes Surah Yunus, verse 14, which translates roughly to, "We made you successors in the land to see how you act."
To see how you act.
Yeah.
That verse literally gives me chills when you place it in the context of a newly formed nation.
It's incredibly heavy.
The author is telling the audience, the citizens and the leaders, political independence is not the finish line you think it is. It is the starting pistol.
The creation of the state is not viewed merely as a political victory over colonizers or, a reason to just wave flags and celebrate.
Right. In this intense philosophical framework, the independent state is the ultimate testing ground for the law of requital.
Because by gaining sovereignty, the nation now has the power and the terrifying burden to implement both sets of laws.
They have the land to build industry, science, and infrastructure, mastering the physical laws.
And they have the legal authority to build justice, equity, and peace, mastering the social laws.
They finally have the controller in their hands. They aren't like NPCs, non-playable characters ruled by a foreign empire anymore. They are the main players in the game.
And the author is warning them with absolute clarity. The grace period for this new nation has officially begun. The clock is ticking.
The universe, through the unforgiving mechanics of the law of requital, is watching to see if you will use your newfound sovereign power to build Jannat, a heaven of salamti and peace.
Or if you will fall into the trap of the materialists, normalize your own corruption and build a hell on earth.
It is a profound, incredibly heavy responsibility.
The author is essentially standing at the birth of a nation and saying, you wanted sovereignty, you fought for it, and you have it, but now you are entirely subject to the unforgiving physics of the moral universe.
Every economic policy you draft, every act of bureaucratic corruption you ignore, every instance of justice you uphold will trigger an equal and opposite reaction that will definitively determine the survival or the destruction of the nation.
You cannot blame anyone else anymore.
So what does this all mean for us, the listener, right now, decades later, and perhaps half a world away?
Yeah, how do we apply this today?
We've journeyed from the shattered glass on the floor to the definition of true science to the rise and fall of civilizations.
The core takeaway from this deep dive is a massive paradigm shift in how we view the reality we interact with every single day.
Right. We are not just biological participants in a physical ecosystem bound by gravity, thermodynamics, and cellular biology.
We are simultaneously living in a highly sensitive moral ecosystem, a social ecosystem, governed just as strictly by the law of requital.
Every intent we harbor, every word we speak to a colleague, every economic action we take in our social spheres ripples outward with absolute, inescapable consequences.
You cannot cheat the social physics any more than you can cheat gravity.
The ledger is always, always balancing itself, even if the math is currently hidden in the grace period.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, building on that profound concept of the grace period.
Okay, let's hear it.
We as humans often look around our lives, and if things are generally peaceful, if our bank accounts are stable, if we aren't facing immediate crises or health scares, we naturally assume that this comfort is a cosmic confirmation that we are living correctly.
We view peace and quiet as a reward for our good choices.
Right. But if we truly internalize the terrifying mechanics of the law of requital and the reality of Mohlat, the necessary delay, we must ask ourselves a deeply unsettling question. What if the peace and quiet you're experiencing in your life right now is not a reward at all?
Oh, wow.
What if that comfort is simply the silent, invisible ticking of your own personal grace period?
Just counting down.
What if it is merely the quiet gap of time, patiently waiting for you to finally notice the poisonous seeds you've planted before the inevitable harvest arrives at your door?